Bona nit o bona tarda. Soc l'Ignacio del Domínguez i començarem amb una breu presentació de la professora Jasbir Puar en català i després passem a la conversa en anglès. D'acord? Segurament la immensa majoria ja coneixeu la carrera de la professora Jasbir Puar, que és professora distingida de la Facultat d'Arts de l'Institut de Justícia Social de la Universitat de Colúmbia Britànica i des de principis de la dècada del 2000 ha estat a l'avantguarda de la recerca i el pensament sobre vincles entre espai, violència, sexualitat, entre moltíssims altres temes. A través de la intersecció de les realitats queer, el terrorisme, l'espai, la política, la seva recerca ha informat i alimentat debats activistes i acadèmics sobre com entenem la geopolítica, la visibilitat internacional del gènere i la sexualitat, el colonialisme d'assentament i l'imperialisme i la capacitat i discapacitat. Molts temes. Al llarg de la seva feina podem trobar el paper clau de l'Estat com a un nexe que no és innocent en què cossos, identitats i violència prenen forma i es distribueixen. És autora, entre moltíssimes altres publicacions, de Terrorist Assemblages, Homonationalism in Queer Times i The Right to Maim, Debility, Capacity, Disability. Actualment està treballant en el seu tercer llibre, Slow Life, Settler Colonialism in 5 Parts, que continua la seva exploració del paper de la mutilació i debilitament en la creació de poblacions descartables a Palestina i altres llocs. I també és coautora d'exposicions per a la Triennal d'Arquitectura de Sharjah i la Biennal d'Art de Sharjah. So, now we switch to English. So, we are both unlucky to have like this specific week for us due to the one-year mark of October the 7th. We're going to discuss quite many times these dates, I think. And after this first year, the world seems simultaneously really changed and it's more or less the same. On the one hand, we see that it has changed quite a lot regarding, for example, demonstrations, universities, changing relationship to Israeli universities, demonstrations such as the one in Barcelona last Sunday, and commercial boycotts against specific companies. But on the other hand, we find that national governments, including the Spanish government, are still exporting even weapons to Israel. So we see that they are acting as business as usual. Mm-hmm. What do you make of this apparent dissonance of a new world and more or less the same world?
Yeah, thank you. First, I just want to say thank you so much to everyone for coming, and thank you, Nacho, for being here with me. And it's truly an honor and a privilege to be at this gathering with everyone and be in Barcelona with all of you. It's truly been a difficult year, as everyone knows, and of course, with the expansion of the violence into the West Bank and into Lebanon, we are all struggling, I think, with these feelings of hopelessness and despair, and the sense, as you put it, of things being relatively the same, except that so much has changed. And so I think if we take a longer historical view of the Palestine Solidarity organizing, specifically with the beginning of the academic boycott, which was in 2004, the the BDS call, which was in 2005. Mm-hmm. So we're talking about 20 years now of this kind of attempt to mainstream Palestine, and I think we're here. Palestine has been mainstreamed, and this is a huge, huge moment, actually. I think this is a different moment and different part of the struggle that we've entered into in this past year. So that's something to mark. It's something to be hopeful about. Zionism has lost its cultural hegemony. It's losing its moral and political credibility. It's been exposed for the kind of violent supremacist ideology that it is. And so that's why we're in the position we're in right now, because we're in a pitched battle where more and more people have seen what Zionism really is. And so I think it's important to remember that the reason why we're facing obstacle after obstacle is because Zionism can only rule through threat, coercion, force, violence. It no longer has a kind of moral credibility, in my opinion, no longer has a kind of moral credibility that it has had for so long. So that is huge. We have more students than ever organizing. We have a truly mass mobilization happening globally. More students than ever, more faculty than ever, more faculty and students studying Palestine, teaching about Palestine. So we have more unions signed on to PACB, to BDS. We have more cultural organizations all around the world signing on to PACB. So these are all really good things. I think the last thing I'll mention too is that the question of what international law is and what it's good for is on the table now in the most explicit ways that are really important. So the fiction of international law has truly been exposed, and the global South nations have been leveraging that fiction and kind of displaying the need to kind of reevaluate what good is international law and these kind of legal instruments. And I think the fact that the UN Security Council is actually, the composition of it is now up for debate is also really huge. And I guess I'll add one more thing, which is just the whole notion of kind of liberal freedom of speech expression is also being exposed for the fiction that it is, right? Because we see that in so many cases our freedom of expression is being completely curtailed around what is often called the Palestine exception, right? So we're free to say whatever we want except for Palestine. We're free to express ourselves politically except for Palestine. And so that fiction has also been completely unraveled, I think. So these are all, despite the difficult year, despite what's in front of us, I think this is a huge opportunity. And we're in the best position we've ever been to demand liberation for Palestine.
Thanks so much. I really enjoy that this, I would say conflict, but I'm not going to say conflict, I'm going to say genocide, is showing, is piercing many veils. It's showing many fictions, as you said. And one of these would be international law that has many limitations. And another fiction, I think it shows, you discussed last week in Valladolid in a queer study conference, like this idea that sometimes we use as an argument that Israel is not a lawful state,
right,
that we try to delegitimize Israel. And you said that this is a really limited approach because we are still like buying the framing of there are states that have the right to kill, to dispersal people, to dispose of people. So I wanted to ask you about this, about how can our idea of what a state should be and which is the unit of lawfulness, which is the unit of rights, if we are to refuse, for example, this for the state?
Yeah, I think this is a question in particular, with particular relevance to settler colonial states. And the reason why I think about this is because a Palestinian scholar, Rana Barakat, was once kind of deciphering in a public forum this question, does Israel have the right to exist? Which is what, this is the kind of exceptional question that is often posed to pro-Palestinian solidarity movement people and scholars. And to that question, does Israel have the right to exist? She said, what nation state has the right to exist? So there's a kind of naturalization of the nation state as an inherently force for good, as long as it operates as a proper nation state, and that Israel could and should be a proper nation state. I think we see this also with the recourse to criticizing Netanyahu's government, as opposed to understanding the nation state writ large as a problem, as a violently formed, and through particularly settler colonial societies. So if Israel is an illegal state, so is the United States, so is Canada, so are other settler states, and we have to kind of rethink the Westphalian nation-state model altogether. Ultimately, nation states are driven by biopolitical and necropolitical technologies of rule, kind of in tandem. Even as states are producing life for some populations, they are producing death or neglect or slow death for others. And so we can't really say that there's an inherently, if we're going to call Israel an illegal state, we can't really point to a kind of legal state, is what I would say. But this is a very specific conversation to this question that is always imposed on people: does Israel have the right to exist? And I truly think questioning, and this is also something that indigenous scholars have pointed out to us, that the naturalization of the nation state is at the expense of indigenous extermination and the erasure of indigenous people. So we always have to ask that question about settler colonialism.
Thanks so much. Another idea that I think it's like broken, or at least questioned by this context, is like the distance of conflicts. For example, that on the one hand we see there's like a sea away, not an ocean, but from Barcelona, literally a sea away.
Yeah.
On the other hand, we are seeing it live streamed. We are seeing images. We are seeing live deaths while people are live streaming. How can we understand this like apparent numbness that we may have? How can we, at the same time, we are at the same time like hyper exposed, and we see it on our phones, we see it every single day, and on the other hand, we are almost, particularly the institutions, particularly institutions, are like making it seem it's really a distant conflict that doesn't affect us.
Right, right. I think that there's, I imagine you would have a different answer from the vantage of Spain. From the vantage of the United States, I think it's becoming clearer and clearer that this is not just a quote-unquote war that the U.S. is supporting and is supporting Israel. It's actually a U.S. war at this point, and perhaps always has been a U.S. war. The U.S. is giving $4 billion a year to Israel in support. It just handed over $40 billion worth of aid, the majority of it weapons. And they did this in the context of not having enough money for U.S. citizens and Americans residing in the south of the United States for hurricane relief, right? So this became very apparent in the last couple of weeks, that the government doesn't have enough money to support people through the climate change disasters that they are experiencing, the 2 recent hurricanes. But at the same day, they're sending another $9 billion over to Israel. So when I say this is a U.S. war, I think this idea that Israel-Palestine is this kind of external object to the United States is impossible to sustain. And so increasingly, the American public is waking up to the understanding that Palestine is kind of integral to the way in which the United States imagines itself, and the future of the U.S. is kind of bound up in the future of Israel-Palestine as well. And we have a war economy. The U.S. has a war economy. There's no question. Ideologically, Zionism has as much force in the United States as it has in Israel, and as much institutional support in the United States as it has in Israel. And the ideological function of Israel for the United States is to normalize settler colonialism. So there's a deep need for that kind of dialectical relationship and conversation, that's happening. So there's all of these levels in which, and people are saying this more and more often now, that this is a U.S. war that's happening. It's not just something that the U.S. is supporting. It is actively propagating and invested in. And the images, you wanted to talk about the images. Yes,
because at least we are more or less like numbed to the violence, but at the same time we are hyper exposed to it.
Yes.
Like particularly, for example, I think it was last week that this woman in Lebanon was like live streaming something in her house, and like we saw the actual like bombing. We're going to discuss afterwards like the role of technology, because it's really quite an issue. But how can we wake up? How can we like ask people to wake up to this numbness?
I don't know if it's numbness or it's a kind of ideological conditioning. These images, there's a question about what it means to be a witness to these images and how we participate in these visual economies, and what we're receiving from them. I think as well we have to acknowledge that there is global Islamophobia, global anti-Muslim deep anti-Muslim, anti-Palestinian racism. And so there is an aspect of this viewing practice that I believe brings pleasure to people who are informed by that racism, that they absorb these images and they understand brown Arab bodies to be deserving of the kind of treatment that they are seeing on their screen. So I think we have to think about, what that absorption is actually reinforcing in our psyches, and this idea that there are certain populations that are, and this is what I write about also in The Right to Maim, that biopolitically and necropolitically there are certain racialized populations that are expected to endure certain forms of maiming, certain forms of violence. And so I don't think that we can underestimate what that kind of racial, necropolitical kind of structure expects of us in this watching. And so I think it might take some kind of deconstructing of some of like, well, what is it that we are already conditioned to expect when we see these images. There's also something really devastating going on in terms of the violence now in Lebanon and the kind of destruction of Lebanon, Beirut. More than 2,000 deaths, more than 10,000 people have been injured, majority of which will be permanent disabilities. But there's something really intense about how we have been conditioned to understand Gaza as a humanitarian object in need of rescue. And so there's a whole economy around Gaza that has been built up over the 16, 17 years of the siege, so that we know that this is what happens to Gaza. We know that this Gaza is an open-air prison. We expect this whole kind of disaster capitalism / humanitarian economy to kind of kick into gear. And you can kind of see the way that Gaza has become this object par excellence of humanitarian rescue that Lebanon is not afforded, right? So there's been no concern, as far as I can see in mainstream reporting at all, and no response from the major imperial powers around what's happening in Lebanon right now. And I think, again, that's about the ways in which we are conditioned to understand something in humanitarian terms, but not necessarily in political terms.
Thanks so much. Regarding Lebanon, I think like this concept you really like focus on, these twin concepts, I would say, grievability and disposability, that I think that can be linked more or less. Regarding disposability, what we are seeing right now is like an expansion of disposability and how like increasingly new groups are being targeted and disposed of. Like regarding, for example, the public attention, the political attention from Western countries, like as the disposability expanded to, for example, kids, to families,
yes,
to humanitarian and medical teams, like we saw like an expansion of disposability, really also different levels of grievability, I would say. And now we are seeing like an expansion to literally a different country, to another country. And I wanted to ask you about how can we link this expansion of this invasion to wider ideas of disposability and disposable population, because these are ideas you have worked a lot and they are really, sadly, they are really important right now.
Yeah, sadly. I think this goes back to this links in with the prior question too, around what are we doing with these images and how are we witnessing what is happening. I think that part of what I have tried to map out in my work is, again, this question of who is available for injury and a kind of and maiming and a kind of economy of maiming that makes disposable populations that are racialized, that are deemed not human. I mean, it's been quite devastating, I think, to see some of the reporting, when you see commentators saying things like, these people are human beings, right? We're seeing this more and more, trying to get across the point, because the dehumanization is so incredibly severe and obvious as well. But in the work that I've done around maiming, I've really tried to understand a relationship between annihilating a population, killing a population, and what it means to target them for injury in order to kind of keep them alive, but also deteriorated, debilitated, and part of an economy of value making through being alive but disabled, right? And so there have been several important thinkers around the relationship between capitalism and disability. Marta Russell in particular says, hey, the disabled body is most valuable as a bed, right? So the kind of care and medical and therapeutic economies that kind of are reorganized around bodies that are disabled, maimed, debilitated. So, with Lebanon too, like I think the pager attacks were, again, participating in a visual economy where people, some viewers get some, in a frame of racism, get pleasure from seeing the kind of mutilated brown Arab bodies, right? But you also have a message being sent, I think, which is the only way you will remain alive is by being mutilated, right? So should you survive this, you will be mutilated. And I think that's a kind of relationship between killing and maiming that I have been tracking a longer history of in relation to Israel, but we can see very explicitly now that the conditions of life are about being maimed if you're going to be alive. We can also see this with the genocide as well. There are many hundreds of thousands, if not 2 million people who will survive this genocide, and the question is, what will they be dealing with, right? So there will be widespread health issues, health concerns. There are some 11,500 pediatric amputees. The level of endemic disablement and debility will be huge. And so I think in part, I can't remember what what you started off with the question, but there is a kind of value hierarchy being established here, right? Which goes back to the question of disposability, right? So in the name of the protection of the Israeli body, this is what we're willing to do to Palestinian bodies. This is what the Palestinian body deserves.
Linked to that would be like the issue of grievability that you have also worked on. And I wanted to, not to strictly quote, but during like this week, due to the 1-year mark, Spanish PM Pedro Sanchez tweeted about the Hamas hostages, but didn't mention, as far as I know, any kind of other grievability, any kind of deaths. Whereas, for example, we just saw like on Twitter or X, whatever, really like more an hour plus long video of every single name of Palestinian deaths. How can we explain from this idea of grievability that some lives appear to be ungrievable or differently grievable? Yeah,
I mean, I think this is obviously a reference to Judith Butler's work, but it's also a kind of basic understanding of the relationship between biopolitics and necropolitics and which lives are more worthy than other lives. I think it also speaks to the long history of Orientalism that Edward Said wrote about as well, the kind of understanding of Orientalism as a racializing technology and projection, and also, again, a kind of anti-Muslim, anti-Arab racism that has very much so been centralized around the figuration of the terrorist body, right? So with this propagation of the figure of the terrorist, which really was present during the Cold War, but really took hold in the post-Cold War period, right? And became, during the first Gulf War, and particularly the second Gulf War, post-9/11, post-9/11, you start seeing a real consolidation of this figure of the Muslim terrorist and all of the pathologies attached to the Muslim terrorist, right? And so this is, the accusation of being a terrorist gives kind of writ large, carte blanche, the rationale for any kind of violence directed towards these populations. So it's quite insidious in that way too. It just works in such a blanket way, right? So we don't have complicated discussions about what terrorists are, what they do, or how one gets named as a terrorist. We just have this, racist ideology, basically.
More or less related to the topic, more or less related, but particularly, for example, thanks to the work done on the issue of probability with the HIV/AIDS crisis, for example, you have also worked quite a lot on the role of queerness in geopolitics and in the disposability of specific populations and bodies. And we have seen that queerness is quite relevant in this, in this expansion of genocide, particularly, for example, as Israel became, in part thanks to some activists, for example, in Western countries, thanks to specific cultural products in some cases, thanks to tourism, like the textbook case and paragon of homonationalism, and specific strategies of pinkwashing. We have reached the extreme of these images of apparently LGBTQ, like Israeli soldiers waving flags and waving symbols against like a background of tanks and against a background of demolished buildings. And how can we really grasp this apparent dissonance of people like advertising like that queer lives are worthy, that in Israel queer lives appear to be worthy, against this explicit idea, this blatant idea that many lives are not worthy, that many lives, according to the Israeli Offense Force, they deserve to be wiped out.
Yeah. So the images in question, I think they were released on social media sometime in early to mid-November. And there were two of them in specific, an Israeli, queer Israeli or LGBTQ soldier, Israeli soldier holding a rainbow flag juxtaposed with an Israeli flag, and both scenes of kind of tanks and just scorched earth and rubble and destruction all around. And then the flag said, "In the name of love," in English and also in Arabic. And then there was a kind of exhortation or proclamation that this was the first rainbow flag ever to fly in Gaza, right? So this was generated quite a bit of talk about pinkwashing and this understanding of Israel as using its LGBTQ rights record as a cover or as a way of justifying occupation or as a way of pinkwashing the Comintern, the occupation. I think it's not really a dissonance, actually. I think what we see in those images is, on one hand, this fantasy of freedom articulated through liberal rights frameworks, right? The Israeli soldier. And then on the other hand, Palestinians articulating their demands for freedom through the land, right? And so this is a very actually common juxtaposition, which is indigeneity, so rights and representations through the kind of liberal democratic framework happens through the erasure of indigeneity, through the destruction of their land, and through the disappearance of indigenous bodies. So actually, those images perfectly map the dilemma, which is, liberal rights are afforded to one population, are actually presumed to be the end goal for another population. The other population is actually articulating its demand for freedom through land back, right? The desire to have their land back. And so you actually see the dissonance to be actually at the very core of what indigenous scholars have told us all along, which is any recourse, and this goes back to the question of the settler state as well, right? The legitimacy of the settler state is built upon the erasure and the disappearance of indigeneity and indigenous peoples. So in a weird way, those images spoke very directly to, the crux of what's not being understood, right? And I also think the pinkwashing, even despite the kind of conversation that was generated on social media, I don't think pinkwashing works the way it did 20 years ago. Pinkwashing became, part of this Brand Israel campaign in the early aughts that was very much so about reviving Israel's public image internationally. And so this idea of Tel Aviv as this gay haven was very important, as like the #1 gay tourist destination, all of that stuff, right? And I think because Palestinians did so much work to problematize this discourse, to say, hey, this is a way of obfuscating the deep violence of the Israeli state, the occupation of the Palestinian people. And so it's been almost 20 years of that political education. So what we see now is pinkwashing is not very effective because we have so many queer organizations at the lead, at the forefront of Palestine solidarity organizing, right? We've seen actually a cultural shift here where people recognize the instrumentalization of LGBTQ identity by a state as farcical, I would say. And then on the other side, I would say, a genocidal fascist state does not need good PR, that, pinkwashing is not relevant anymore. We have Netanyahu with blatantly transphobic, homophobic cabinet members, and they don't care about pinkwash. It's not what was happening 20 years ago when the Brand Israel campaign was very much so a public relations effort to rehabilitate Israel's global reputation. That's not what's at stake right now.
Yeah, true. Yeah, may be useful, for example, for a liberal rights approach, or kinda. This idea that this liberal rights approach towards freedom is limited and it's quite linked to pinkwashing, for example, made me think about the role of some international institutions, some global institutions, for example, the World Bank and the IMF, for example, as studied by Raul Rao, for example, as how they have pushed for LGBTQ inclusion in some specific countries, in non-Western countries, reaching the extent of coercion, of economic coercion. And for example, I think that this could be linked to like a moderate attempt that is quite linked to this waving of this rainbow flag, that it may link to like they are saying, like, this liberal rights approach is more important than your own agency, for example. How can we understand this it's a really old issue of how can we like balance the potentially like positive aspects of liberal rights approaches and at least the intention of these institutions with this lack of agency and this coercion, because it's literally coercion.
Yeah, Rahul Rao's work, for those of you who are interested in following up, is on this idea of homo-capitalism, and it's focused on global South countries that don't necessarily have liberal rights, LGBTQ liberal rights platforms, or they're nascent, or there's struggles going on around establishing them. In particular, he looked at a case in Uganda, which happened about a decade ago, where the IMF had lent some money to Uganda with the understanding that there would be a passage of a decriminalization of homosexuality in the works. And when that passage didn't happen, there was a retraction of that money, right? So in that way, what Rahul's work is marking is what he says is a shift from the kind of queer rights as a social justice issue to queer rights as an economic issue. And so there's this, in these global structures of governance, which unlike various authoritarian nation states, is still very wedded to the language of homonationalism, right? It's still very much so. We have our LGBTQ employee group. We have our claims to being liberal, progressive, and invested in LGBTQ inclusion and all of that stuff. So there's a kind of understanding of the cost of homophobia, right? What's the business? What is your business? What is it going to cost your business to partake in homophobic, kind of structural, whatever, your corporate structures, et cetera, your government structures, et cetera. So, and I guess Rahul's really making an argument for the way in which LGBTQ organizing in these spaces manipulates this particular kind of economic incentive, right? And kind of subverts it and plays along with it. So all of these homo-nationalist and pink-washing structures do not have any real interest in the agency of LGBTQ people. So it's always about managing our agential capacities and our demands for liberation of freedom despite all of this kind of instrumentalization. But Rahul, kind of marks this kind of economic rights in lieu of liberal rights, right? As something that's kind of nascent in the global South. I think we can actually look at something like the pink dollars phenomena in the 80s and 90s, right? Where this was very much so in the case in the United States, where you didn't have the legalization of gay marriage, you didn't have the legalization of adoption, all of these other things that have grown over the past 20 to 30 years. But what you had was the queer consumer, right? And you had the disciplining of homophobia through money, through capital, right? And so in some sense, what Rahul is describing in the Global South was very much so a phenom in the Global North in the 80s and 90s, where you don't have your rights from the state, but you do have your capital, and if you have, so there was a kind of engendering and propping up of the gay consumer, and of course that whole narrative about gay men having more like a gay male couple having more purchasing power than anyone else, right? And any other familial formation. So I think we can actually link some of this stuff, that there has been a long history of recourse to the market when the state fails to provide basic protections, right? Alex Chasin wrote a book about this called Selling Out, which came out in the late 90s.
Yeah, I think that it also links to, for example, the expansion of the genocide via the idea of value, because we're always discussing the apparent value of populations. And I think that, for example, with the use of a specific technology by Israel, we see the role of value, I think. For example, when they started, for example, uprooting and felling olive trees, when they started, for example, destroying the conditions of subsistence, and then when we saw, for example, the use of Grindr and specific apps, then with the pager attack, and we are seeing, for example, that what we consider military technology is now really an expansive concept.
Yes.
And for example, in the case of Spain, we have this critique towards the Spanish government because of the sale of military technology to Israel. With the same with other countries. But how can we change our focus if any kind of technology can be of military use? When we cannot trust, for example, these devices, when we cannot trust the phone, when we cannot trust any kind of technology, it's depressing, I think. Yeah,
two things. One is that so much of our technology comes from initial application within military realms, right? So email was part of kind of military infrastructure to begin with. So much of what we receive as consumer goods, as consumer goods that are supposed to make our lives better, have already been widely in use for militarized purposes, right? So the U.S. is already a kind of embedded in an everyday militarization, and Israel very much so, a highly militarized society. So there's no aspect of life in Israel that isn't already kind of saturated with the idea of militarization and securitization in its day-to-day workings. And of course, our phones are tracking us. They are surveillance tools of surveillance, and it's always a question of how one is accessed through those phones, right? So Grindr becomes an example. So there's recent reports, and this is not new news actually, but it was recently reported that Israel was using Grindr to entrap Palestinian gay men in particular, to then blackmail them around outing them, and then kind of training them or entrapping them to become informants for Israel, which is a common actual phenomena, this kind of finding out information that you don't want your family to know, turning you into an informant, and then kind of manipulating you that way. So this has been going on, this production of the informant has been going on for a long time. What was so horrifying about the pager attacks is, on one hand, high administrative officials in upper governmental echelons were calling this a clear act of terrorism. And on the other hand, people were participating in this techno-fetishistic affirmation of, oh, look at this incredible thing that happened. You managed to recreate like a kind of massacre through this dispersed massacre through these everyday objects. And so there's of course this question of like, when is it going to happen again? To whom is it going to happen again? We do, we have, I think, another problem here, which is this techno-fetishistic approach means that this is of interest, right? And it specifically, those pagers were set up to have enough ammunition in them to maim, but not enough to kill, right? And so the very specific goal of that was to send a signal that your bodies are available for maiming.
Yeah. This use of technology that I think we can see that it's also being used to contest, to organize demonstrations, to organize encampments. So we've got like this, it's not, I wouldn't say it's a dissonance, it's any tool that can be used for maiming and for building a house, for example. So we've got like more or less, I think, 18 minutes left before the Q&A. I wanted to ask you about the agency, about resistance, about the mobilization in different countries, particularly in the States. So, last week in Valladolid, you like discussed this context we are living as a clear signal of the failure of decolonial and intersectional thoughts and academia to contest or to stop this. And we discussed, for example, the role of universities, of academia. You mentioned, for example, this vulnerability of students as the leading voices in U.S. Universities, and you also mentioned the fact that like the most like powerful or stable figures, for example, tenured figures are not leading when they are the ones that have the least to lose. What can we, like academia as a whole and specific scholars, specific students, do here in the US, everywhere to change the framing, to contest the framing, and to change, for example, in Spain, how we frame this? I think it's really a lot of responsibility.
Yeah, I can mostly speak to the U.S. context and say something about how there's two academias, right? There's the academy that is more than happy to participate in the production of decolonial ideas, concepts, intersectional ideas, concepts, analyses, transnational ideas, concepts, analyses, but are going to stay silent when those modes, particular decolonization, are happening in real time, right? So we've seen that criticism arise around, particularly in Palestine. And I do think that the tenure system in the United States, it actually does not free you up. For many people, it doesn't free people up to speak. It actually inculcates a hierarchy of silence, right, around this. So that is why I think like 15, 20 years ago, it was mostly tenured faculty and a small number of tenured faculty speaking up around Palestine, and also losing aspects of their career, being targeted by Zionists for harassment, all of that stuff. But now you see, and I think this bespeaks the second version of the academy, you see students who have nothing to lose, but everything. They will not partake in this university that's asking for this silence. They will not do it. And so I have been humbled. I think many of my colleagues who have been in the academy for a long time have been incredibly humbled by the fact that students are putting their bodies on the line. And nothing will be the same in US universities ever again, and Canadian universities ever again. I honestly feel that way, because the students have forced the administrations of the schools that they go to say the word Palestine. The thing that they don't want to do, say the word Palestine. So where I now work at University of British Columbia, the president released these statements in October, November last year, refused to say the word Palestine. So, these things, they're incremental, but they matter so much that the students force the administration through an encampment to have to talk to them about Palestine. These things are huge. They also bespeak the absolute refusal on the part of students who have this academy to shape, to be in, and to transform, refusal to participate in business as usual, absolute. And in that way, I think we're in a new moment of organizing. Nobody knows what it means to organize a mass mobilized solidarity movement, right? Like, this is something that hasn't happened since South Africa and anti-apartheid, maybe even Vietnam, So we're talking about everyone kind of figuring out where they belong in this and what to do. And the students are, I think, leading the way on this. So it's incredibly powerful. So even as we're seeing one version of the academy in the United States say, hey, you can't wear keffiyehs, you can't put political posters on your doors, you can't have certain kinds of events, you can't protest unless you apply for a permit 30 days ahead of time. The shutdown on the efforts that U.S. universities are going to ensure that the encampments don't happen again are just unbelievable. The amount of political repression is unbelievable. And in that way, I think that whether Kamala Harris gets elected or Donald Trump gets elected, it won't matter to the university, because the university is at the forefront of shutting this shit down, right? So it's really intense. But you have students refusing to concede to that version of the university. They're fighting for a different version of the university, for a version we haven't seen yet. So I think there's a lot to be galvanized by.
Nice. Yeah, I think we had like a similar experience of encampments here in several universities, and we just had a recent action, also led by particularly students, and there's this like Catalan Zionist journalist that I think it was yesterday or the day before yesterday, like some activists threw red paint to her, and I saved this picture, the image, because it's really like impressive. And I wanted to ask you about if in the US you're having also this kind of direct action against specific Zionist figures.
There have been direct actions against politicians, for sure, like in the New York City area. There have been, you probably saw on social media the scream outs. So the former president of Columbia University, mobs of people gathered in front of her residence, just shrieking at midnight for hours. Those kinds of direct action. There's so much of that stuff going on. And the truth of it too is that students are losing. They're giving up their futures for this work. In some ways, they're giving up their normative futures, right? So there's students who have been kicked out of school. They're not allowed to graduate. They're not allowed to come back to campus. The courts have thrown out these cases, but the university is still punishing them, disciplining them. So they are putting a lot on the line here. And it's important to recognize that they are the lead. That they are the lead, that we as faculty, as far as I'm concerned, we are there to learn from.
Amazing. Like this, I'm always like on the lookout for the flag, just in case. Like this morning I discussed this like boycott that some people did against the Eurovision Song Contest this year. We lost the flag. Can somebody get it, please? And for example, compared to these kind of actions in which, for example, students in the US are losing tuition money, are being expelled, like that we got like this like cheap or inexpensive like boycotts that was really simply like refusing to watch the Eurovision Song Contest without really like changing it because it was being like broadcasted equally. How can we like use this kind of like inexpensive or cheap kinds of like boycott? Because in my opinion, and this is my opinion, that we don't really change much if we refuse like watching a TV show that it's already being made. What can we do, like for example, regarding specifically like cultural products like media?
I mean, I'm thinking about.
Thanks.
I'm not sure I have an answer around the media per se. I'm not sure. I'd have to think about. And Eurovision is a thing here.
It's really local.
It's not so much in the United States, although I always hear about what's happening. I mean, I think we talked a little bit about this last week, but there is a politics of refusal happening right now that are really important, and that politics of refusal, which comes from Black feminist work in the U.S., it comes from indigenous feminist work, is really about refusing a kind of epistemological coherence or epistemological complicity or expectation, right? So refusing the status quo, withdrawing from a kind of reformist politics, or it really has to do with not meeting the expectations of the status quo, withdrawing from the expectations. So I think the students are doing that. I think they're saying, we don't want this university, you have to give us a different university. We're fighting for a different university. In the United States, the uncommitted movement has been under a lot of pressure to endorse Kamala Harris, and they have refused. And their response to their critics is, give us a Kamala Harris that is not supporting genocide, and we will vote for her. This is another politics of refusal that has profound impacts, especially now that the Lebanese American population has been drawn into that, because the Lebanese American population is huge and is everywhere. And some of them may have voted for Harris before, even though Palestine was an issue. They're not going to vote for her now. So there is a kind of interesting politics of withdrawal and refusal that's happening politically right now that I think is very powerful.
Yeah, no, I think too. I think it's because it's simply like refusing the frame. Yeah. My last question, and then I think we will move to the Q&A, is you mentioned earlier today like the change in for example, that the discussion of the Palestinian cause is now mainstream, at least in some concepts, and you specifically mentioned like this is hopefulness. This is like a new state, for example. And thanks. And for example, we are right now in Barcelona, and for example, the stance of this local government as opposed to the national government in Spain is quite different.
Yes.
And we are seeing the same with specific institutions, really like smaller institutions, and specific universities, particularly thanks to students, that are making a stance, whereas like national governments are quite different, going from full support, such as the German government, and like mild but equally shameful support, for example, the Spanish government with still exporting specific weaponry, for example, and not like changing the diplomatic status of Israel, for example. What can we do as individuals? Because, for example, I really love the discussion of agency as in terms, for example, of pinkwashing. I really love the topic of what can we do as individuals and also as groups. What can we do, like as a group right here, like discussing these issues, and we will now get to the Q&A. And what can we do as individuals?
I think keep organizing, keep mobilizing. That's it. This is what's in front of us right now. To keep pushing, keep mobilizing, keep disrupting, keep refusing, keep withdrawing, keep challenging. Yeah, do what we've always been doing.
Lovely. Thanks so much. This is all from my side. I think like 2 minutes early, or a little bit more. So I think we can switch to the Q&A if possible. The thing is that I don't think we see you.
Yeah, we don't really see you.
This way,
we should take a couple at a time.
Yes,
I think.
and we thought about taking a couple at a time. Do you want this? Because they are going to interpret. If you want to ask in Catalan or Spanish, I'm told that there is translation for Jasbir. And we thought about taking a couple at a time.
Okay, I can ask in English if it's okay.
He speaks English.
Yeah, I speak English.
No, he speaks English.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you very much for the conversation. It was really interesting. First of all, I just wanted to briefly mention that the people that yesterday threw paint to Pilar Rahola, these Zionist figures, they were actually communist, and they asked to recognize them as communist. Yeah, and then I wanted to ask you, Jasbir, if there is any link, or there could be potentially some link between the concept of disposability and disposable population and the Marxist concept of surplus population, especially as a lot of scholars have recently been talking about the ways in which gender and race function as technologies of governance of surplus populations. Thank you.
Oh, yeah, sorry, we're going to take a few questions, but the immediate answer is yes.
No veo. No es veu res. Sou brillantor.
Hello. I'll stand so you can see a silhouette, at least, of a person. My name's Musa, so you're talking to a person. But you write a lot about the concept of maiming and disability, and I'm curious, how does this idea of harm and dismemberment relate to the concept of epistemicide and trying to kill an entire ways of knowing and being in relation to the earth?
I feel absolutely ridiculous like that. No, I don't think we've got any more questions.
Raise your hand high.
No, I don't think we've got any more questions right now. Yeah, we can. Yeah,
Sure. To the first comment about, or question about disposability and surplus populations, and the specific mention of a kind of Marxist understanding of surplus populations. And we have a number of other concepts that we can kind of link together as contiguous, sometimes but also in certain ways distinct from each other, like organized abandonment from Ruthie Gilmore, for example. So these are all really, really important. For me, disposability is really about understanding a population that is valuable in its injured and debilitated state, and so would otherwise be disposable, right? So it's not disposability as such, it is what happens in the name of value creation around an otherwise disposable population, which I think is not so distinct from surplus population in a particular way. There is a relatively new book called Health Communism that lays out what surplus is and our proximity to the category of surplus in a very clear way, and through a kind of disability justice and disability framework. And so articulates surplus as something that we are always in fear of becoming, right? If not, we are always already surplus, right? Or on the verge of surplus. And that verge, that understanding of the verge is very much so about one's relationship to health and disability and productivity, right? So in that sense, surplus populations, I think, is a concept that really hinges upon this understanding of economic productivity and the body as a kind of economically productive in a way that disposability isn't quite as wedded to. So that might be like one small distinction between the two concepts. The question about maiming and disability and dismemberment and epistemicide, so the killing the entire ways of knowing. Obviously, this is a huge concern right now with the kind of mass destruction that's going on during this genocide. I will say, so two things. One, even as There is an attempt at erasure, attempt at epistemicide, this complete annihilation of ways of being. There is an archive that is bigger than ever around Palestine, right? Like we have it at our disposal, we have it in front of us. And so I think we have to see this question of ways of knowing and ways of being as in constant production through the genocide, not despite it, but through it, right? So epistemicide is actually something that's impossible when a genocide is being documented in the way that it's being documented right now. So that's the kind of paradox, right, of the population that's being attempted to be exterminated is actually documenting these attempts. And so we have the archive, we have the ever-growing archive. And I wanted to point out to, if you don't already know, Nadra Shalab-Kevorkian's brilliant work, but also an interview that she did with the Makdisi brothers, that was the interview that got her suspended at Hebrew University, where she talked about what it meant that Palestinians in Gaza were collecting the limbs of their beloved, right, of their beloveds. They were gathering the limbs. It was a literal kind of understanding of, I call it rememberment in the face of dismemberment, and the refusal to be anything but differently whole, you know? And so I think that is an active process and practice that is happening. And you also hear some of this from Ghassan Abu Sitta, who's that incredible surgeon who was in Gaza for a while and is based in Lebanon and based in London and Glasgow, and then also in Beirut, is now in Beirut. And he has been narrating the production of disability as this function of the colonizer attempting to mark the body, like forever mark the body. So these amputations, today I was watching him on Al Jazeera, he was talking about when they amputated these children's limbs, they put the limb in a box with the name of the child on it and gave the box to the family so the family could appropriately mourn and bury the limb. And so there's that process of rememberment happening in those practices also there. And what he said was, it's imperative that the colonizer's mark become a badge of honor, right? And so the refusal of that, again, a kind of politics of refusing the colonizer's mark, the amputated limb. There's a long history of the discussion of amputation in Gaza, in Gazan literature, and in Gaza itself, because there's a quote-unquote amputee crisis that has been going on well before now, and also in part through the 2018 to 2020 Great March of Return. So and this is all to say that epistemicide is never going to happen because of these practices of rememberment.
Yeah, I was thinking about, for example, the US media outlet Vox that has this section called Missing Chapter of specifically other cases, for example, the Tulsa massacre, and some things that we don't have like documentation of. Like this is the opposite.
Yes.
Case.
It is actually an archive of abundance, not of dearth, not of death. It's an abundant archive, which is a kind of turn in archival studies to think about archives as overflowing with material.
Encara que les dues preguntes hagin estat en català, recordatori de que en anglès, si voleu podeu preguntar en català o en castellà, que tenim interpretació, d'acord? Per si us fa vergonya, que no cal, que pot ser en català o en castellà. Yes, there are more questions.
There's two hands over there.
Yes, no.
Hi, thank you for your talk. And yeah, I wanted to ask from a critical disability studies perspective, how is it possible to make it compatible to denounce the violence that is involved in, the maiming of Palestinian bodies, while at the same time not falling into the narrative of the tragedy of disability, the tragedy of having a main body, the idea that disability is a kind of punishment. How can we make it compatible so as not to reproduce this narrative that disability is the worst thing ever that can happen to you? Thank you.
Hello, thank you for your talk. I want to, excuse me, I see universities in the United States as being kind of at the forefront of progressive values. Can you hear me? Yeah.
A little bit higher, please.
A little bit.
Yeah, louder,
yeah,
louder,
there we go.
yes.
So I see universities, at least in the United States, as being at the forefront of promoting progressive values. And so if it is the case that they are now being kind of delegitimized by not standing up for certain oppressed groups or selectively standing up for oppressed groups, what do you think might be the effect, especially on student-age populations, in light of this kind of void of, an organization, an institution that actually is academic and thinking about the future and progressive values? And in particular, is there anything that you could say to us? I mean, I'm looking around at this group of young people in light of not being able to trust certain universities on certain topics. Who can we turn to?
So to the first question, thank you for that. I think I've thought a lot about this, and I think the reality in Palestine is that disability is a punishment. It is a punishment by the settler colonial rule. And so we have to, I think, get out of our critical disability studies, global north paradigm, and understand something different about mass impairment. Because what we are watching on our screens right now is the first televisualized genocide as mass impairment. And this is where scholars who are writing from the global south in the kind of formation of global southern disability studies have a lot to say to us about not liberalizing the function of mass impairment, right, through genocide, and not liberalizing the effect of that. Helen and Mikosha, in particular, wrote this piece, Decolonizing Disability, more than a decade ago, and I feel that the piece in the Global North in disability studies is given lip service, but not really fully taking on the understanding of what mass impairment entails, right? So having said, so I don't think it's about making things compatible with the Global North frame. I think it's about honoring the epistemology and the knowledge that's coming out of the Global South. And so the lexicon, the information, the knowledge that's coming from Palestine, the information that's coming from Ghassan Abu Sitta and other doctors, I think we have to honor their perspectives and that knowledge, regardless of whether it clashes with our own understanding of what we think disability should be. It is not the same thing, and it cannot be reconciled, and it cannot be made compatible because we want it to be made compatible. Having said that, I will just reiterate what Ghassan Abu Sitta said, which was, in order to refuse the colonizer's mark of amputation, of disfigurement, of disability, the amputated limb needs to become something of a badge of honor, right? A kind of marking of what it is that the body has endured and will continue forthwith. So I think there's a lot of a kind of anti-colonial understanding of disability in that statement that I think is really valuable. To the second question, I feel like we've talked quite a bit about what universities, for example, in North America are doing. I think understanding the fiction of the university as a progressive place is really quite important. right now at this moment. Because, for example, the place where I used to work at Rutgers University in New Jersey just released a kind of document, dozens of pages long, called Free Expression at Rutgers, right? What did that document contain? It contained hundreds of rules about how you were allowed or not allowed to express yourself at Rutgers, right? So dozens of rules about the containment of protests, disallowing encampments, requiring permits, requiring prior permission. You cannot use a bullhorn on campus. You cannot, all of these prohibitions in the name of free expression, right? So this is the bullshit, right, of progressive universities right now. This is what we're seeing. So I think we have to kind of cut through that discourse and understand that liberal education is not what we are being offered in the university, and we have to kind of fight for that progressive university. We have to fight for it again. The other thing I will say is that universities are sites of labor exploitation. And so we always have to understand the university as a site of struggle in terms of labor relations. And I think that that's something that's really happening right now on US campuses in particular. Rutgers has an incredibly strong union, but it's understanding the adjunctification of and the kind of losing of tenure and the adjunctification of professors as a way of draining the political power of speech and of using precarity against to hedge against political speech. And the interesting thing is it's not working. It's not working. Adjuncts are up there in front, fighting for better working conditions and also fighting for Palestine and fighting for critical race theory and fighting for the use of intersectionality. So everyone is in, I think this is very different from 20 years ago when I first started working on Palestine. Right now, everyone is in really good company. Really, really good company. The solidarity is really, really brilliant and empowering.
Thanks so much. I think this is all the time we have. Thanks so much, Jasbir, for this enriching conversation. Thanks so much to the Biennale, and thanks so much to all of you.